Welcome to the Oshow. I'm Laura Babcock. There is a crisis in homelessness and a lack of affordable housing and rental in the province of Ontario. There's actually a worldwide crisis in homelessness, but particularly in Ontario. We are dealing with income insecurity and an absolute lack of available, affordable housing and transitions into rental and housing properties. So on this show, we decided to look at the crisis around homelessness and around housing together as part of a continuum. And we've brought together a panel of experts who have their own vantage point on the issue. Renee Wetselaar, she's from St. Matthew's House. Shkimba, of course, you're a regular here on the Oshow. And as a columnist in the Hamilton Spectator, Margaret wrote a column this week about the city kind of being at war with homelessness and using our tax dollars in a way that seems so crazy. I just had to have her on to speak to it from her vantage point. And Stewart as well, he is a member of the board of ACORN, which does all kinds of advocacy around people who deal with income insecurity and housing. And Stewart, it's so great to have you on the program. This is often seen as a hopeless issue, right? It's so big and it's so broad and it's so complex that people think I just can't fix it, so I'm not going to deal with it. But yet at St. Matthew's House, part of what your mandate is, your raison d'etre, is to offer hope. So I hope you can give us some hard realities and some hope as well. So from your perspective, being right there, helping people who are in need, where are we with our homelessness?
Well, as you alluded to before, of course, Laura, it is a crisis. It's a global crisis, and there are so many different factors that impact all of this, right? Forced migration, war, the economy. I mean, it goes on and on. But as you said, in Ontario particularly, we're facing a certain kind of pressure, and it's causing a lot of kind of counterintuitive actions to happen in a way. For example, people are complaining that shelters are full of refugees and that folks who are, from Hamilton are not getting access to shelters. So people are being really pitted against each other in a really terrible way. So I'm glad you speak about hope, because for me, hope is also combined with optimism and action. So, I know today, for example, that there are 261 people in this city who are absolutely unhoused, right? And so we have a team of workers that go around 7 days a week and try and support them. And I hear so often the frustration that, what is the city doing? And, there's no action and it seems to all be stalled. And certainly from our perspective, we have seen that. And what we've been trying to do is kind of break up the crossfire between MLE, who are breaking up encampments, the police who are breaking up encampments, and then our team who are supposed to be in there supporting people. So again, Margaret, I know you'll pick up on this quite easily, that there are various systems that are broken. But at the same time, we know, for example, in the last 6 months, because St. Matthew's House has a paralegal that we've managed to hire on our team, we have prevented 33 evictions, right? And 33 evictions means that 33 units remain in the affordable housing system. So we try and see it as a positive from that end. So for us, we try and work both upstream, if you will, and across stream. And I don't like to say downstream because of the connotation it has for people who are unhoused. And we also have to look at, the fact that, of course, a lot of effort and energy was put into HATS and what all of that disaster kind of resulted in, which is a lot of nothing, right? And I tend to think that, whether it's a hard shelter like HATS or a soft shelter like a tent, we need to think about this thing in a little more of an equitable way, that whether your tent is a cloth wall or a brick wall, people need to be given the same opportunity and treated the same way. We are not building enough housing. And Laura, I've been saying this for, almost 15 years. We've been calling and talking about this crisis, knowing that the average age of a woman who's living outside, her average age of death is 43 now, and it was 46. It's gone, the mortality rates have worsened. So there is a lot of broken system, but Stewart and Margaret, there is hope, and it's really, really hard to see, but it's these, one-on-one tangible breakthroughs that we can have and say, hey, let's fix this. So We see a lot from all sides.
It's a great way to set the table, Renee. And I have to say, when we worked way back on the weather campaign, which I think you're alluding to, the fact that women living in homelessness are looking at a lifespan, a life expectancy in Canada, in one of the richest countries in the world, of 43 years old. I mean, for the rest of us who have homes or housing, we're looking at, do I make my 70s? Do I make my 80s? The idea that you could die at 43 in Canada because of a lack of shelter, I think is shameful. And so I'm glad that you brought up that reality for us, and we'll get to some of the hope, but let me go to you, Stewart, because I mean, part of what ACORN has been doing so, I think, successfully, and you can tell me what you think, is just advocating for for renovictions to stop. Right? Like, why do people think people are ending up on the streets? Because they're being rent-evicted and they can't find another place. But I mean, that's just my take. From the perspective of the work that you're doing with ACORN, how do you look at this crisis between homelessness and accessing shelter and housing?
So I think that we're giving landlords too much power, and they're able to abuse the system for massive amounts of profits. And when it comes to renovictions, N13 forms, which is the form to evict someone for the purpose of renovating the unit, in 2012, 6 N13s were filed in the city, but was over 100 just last year alone. So like that amount has just skyrocketed, and it's because landlords want to get older tenants who have lower rent protected rates, which are lower than market. They want to get them out so they can charge more. And if we look at the average rent, a 1-bedroom apartment in Hamilton 7 years ago was about $875. Now it's $1,699, which is just insane. It's a massive increase over just 7 years. And as far as the city housing wait list goes, that's over 6,000 households waiting on that wait list. There's not, like, we're talking years, if not decades, for people to actually get through that wait list and have a place offered to them. But the city's also losing massive amounts of social housing, as well as low rental units. From 2016 to 2021, we lost an average of 46,000 units per year. And in the last 5 years, it was 322,000 total.
Why?
So,
why?
Because landlords want newer buildings. Newer buildings are now no longer rent controlled at all. So if you can build a new building, you know that every year you'll be able to increase the rent by however much you want. If you can get a tenant out of the unit, then when you do rent it again, you can set the rate at whatever you want. And that's one of our demands for the provincial government, is vacancy control. So in between tenants, there's a limit as to how much the rent can be increased. And we just need a lot more regulation if we're going to get a grip on this at all.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but given that we have a provincial audience on the Oshow, wasn't it the Ford government who took away the rent controls? I mean, that was one of their policy initiatives, right? And because I'm looking at the Ontario Municipalities, the Association AMO of Municipalities of Ontario, and they're demanding that the Ontario government immediately increase social assistance rates, make good on promises to transform the social assistance system, increase the supply of deeply affordable community housing, continue to invest in community-based mental health and addiction services, including supportive housing, and continue to increase the base funding for the homeless prevention program to enhance emergency shelter programs. So I mean, they're going right at the province on that, but it seems to me that this idea of removing rent controls sort of precipitated the explosion of the issue. Is that a fair assessment?
The typical thinking that the market's just going to take care of it, right? And that's going to create all this housing, and they'll be able to build to meet the demand. And of course, everyone will make enough money and live happily ever after. It's just interesting to hear that from AMO, because you think maybe AMO 10, 15 years ago, they're advocating roads and water systems and infrastructure. They didn't talk about social issues like that, right? And so this is it just shows you how deeply embedded this problem is.
When I saw your column where you asked the question, like, why are what are we doing? We're using our money to fight the homeless as opposed to essentially the issue. And I put that out, and someone from Peterborough said that their council, did a tiny shelter program, and it was kind of like up and running right away. And I thought about the juxtaposition with Hamilton and this protracted fight and the bullying and the NIMBYism and it just like, what is wrong, Margaret, from your perspective? What are we doing?
Well, first of all, it's about land. Who controls the land, right? The Kitchener, and I had a conversation with the lawyer who was involved with the case, just to make sure that I could understand what was going on. Yeah. There was a decision in Kitchener that said that the homeless people who are experiencing homelessness could camp out in parking lots. And I hope I'm getting this completely right. Because there were no shelter spaces available for them, right? So in the lieu of shelter spaces, then they had the right to find shelter wherever they could find it, which was on the parking lot. Now the decision dealt with the parking lot. Hamilton is dealing with parks. So we're fighting for control of the city is fighting for control of our park space. And we're trying to keep the homeless people out of the parks. So this has become now a constitutional sort of human rights challenge. It's going before the Supreme Court. I think there's a case in Kingston that was heard recently. What happened with Hamilton was clearly meant to be a delaying tactic in terms of hoping that the judge would find in favor of Hamilton's motion to restrict the number of expert witnesses, and then the homeless people would be expected to pick up this $10,000 tab, which they would be expected to pay before they could go ahead with any more litigation. And that would effectively kill everything right then and there, right? So, this is something that, now there's one piece, the piece around this control over park land, and we're fighting this argument on the backs of the poor, vulnerable people, right? This is just incredible to me that we would be doing this. We go back to, we've talked about this a number of times, and I made a list of things that I wanted to talk about. And I really want to point this out. The irony to me is that we talk about this as being an emergency. This is a crisis situation, an emergency. It's been stated over and over. I think council called it an emergency in order that we could access some kind of federal funding that would help with our program, our problems. But God help us if we were to ever really experience a real emergency. Like a neighborhood blows up, a massive fire breaks out, an earthquake happens. I mean, it's an emergency, something that we don't foresee, but hundreds and hundreds of families are displaced from their homes. What would we do as a community?
The opioid crisis, is that enough, Margaret? I'll point that out, right?
Sorry, what's that?
I was going to say the opioid crisis is enough of that tsunami in and of itself, right?
Well, we had it in the pandemic. And we built a tent in a parking lot of a hospital that, to my recollection, was never used.
Correct.
Right? How much money went into that? Yeah. That money could be better spent in using that tent for something else. This idea that we can't solve this problem is, to me, ludicrous. We just lack the political will to step forward and I'm not going to say force the solutions, but there is a certain amount of, and coercion isn't a much better word, but there's a certain amount of way in which people have to be brought along more aggressively, assertive.
We need leadership. We need leadership. We need
I was going to say, isn't that what leadership is? Yeah.
We need a council who says, we cannot have one Hamiltonian die this winter on the freaking street when we are heating a giant mausoleum of a city hall and they can't even stay near the vents. We kicked them out of the vents that were giving them heat. I posted this. We were at my son's championship football game. We're out in the field in the pouring, freezing rain for 3 hours, and we're all bitterly cold and miserable, but we knew we could go home. We knew we could go home and warm up. And all I could think of was, what hope does does a homeless person have in this city? When we have empty buildings, and the former chair of the Hamilton School Board reached out to me before this show, Alex Johnston, and she said, you know, we offered our empty schools during the pandemic for the homeless. We offered space, right? But it wasn't taken. So we're in a situation where we know we have these tents, we know we have these buildings, we have our own freaking city hall, but it's too good for people who are dying on our streets. If there was a flood, we'd let them go in city hall as an emergency shelter, but we can't let them go in when they're freezing to death. And I'm sorry, but when I saw John Paul Danko put out a post the other day saying the real problem in Hamilton is not homelessness, it's not this, that, and that, it's about economic lands and okay, we need to have investment and business, and I get it. I used to run a chamber of commerce. But tell that person who's freezing
criminalization of it's the criminalization of the poor. It's the constant dehumanizing and criminalization of the poor. Like it's like we're not talking about real people, right? It's
I
like
thought if I read that post of someone freezing, and I saw city councilors say the problem's not that people are going to die freezing tonight, it's we don't have enough business parks. I was like, not to the person who's freezing to death.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Like, so
I know. And, you know, we're the ones that are left, you know, when the person does die and try and arrange the funeral and connect this person to possibly a family and deal with the trauma of all the people who supported that person for a very long time. It's horrible. It is a dearth, a disease, you know, it's a crisis. And I think there is such a fear and a bias with our city council that they cannot get over themselves to find it in themselves to literally open their hearts and provide some hope in their own neighborhoods, right? And it's all about not me, not me, not me. And we will never, ever, you know, sanction a sanctioned encampment site, which, you know, for Pete's sakes, if at least we could give people water, washrooms, hydro, Wi-Fi, how can that be so difficult, people? It's fear and criminalization and dehumanization of the poor.
So other cities do it though. London has it set up where they bring all those things to people in tents wherever they are. They don't kick their tents out, they bring them help, right? We have a hospital in Toronto that just got in a bunch of trailers from the back of trucks and set it up so they could help the homeless population who's using their ER all the time with better service. They just put them in their parking lot because they're like, hello, we've got other health networks that are saying this is a crisis in our hospital system as well. We all need to be solution partners. I mentioned Peterborough and the fact that they got their tiny shelters up quickly. I mean, there are places, Renee, that are beyond the fear and the criminalization and just saying someone in front of us is going to die. Like we need food and shelter and we have it.
Yeah. And I can tell you the staff I work with in the housing division, they feel it. And, you know, people might be pointing fingers at the bureaucrats, but they're dealing with a horrific situation because they cannot move things forward with the attitude of the people who are holding power in this city.
When we saw what happened with the North End, right? And that, you know, a councillor was getting death threats. Right. Yeah. Like, so let me go to you, Stewart, because I mean, you're in this all the time. The city made headlines across Canada when there were people who couldn't even get running water in a building last year. And, you know, like, so from your perspective at ACORN, what do you need from the city? What do you need from the province specifically? And when do you need it so that people can put that pressure on leadership that we're talking about?
So that was 1083 Main Street East, and a little bit of news on that because I know that you did mention it on the show earlier. David Galvin's renovation case was just dismissed by the Landlord Tenant Board because it was determined that the form he received was defective. So, you know, we've won that one. It doesn't mean that there won't be another form in the future or anything like that. There's one remaining case that's finished, and we're just waiting to hear the decision. But I don't think that there's a solution that any one level of government can implement to solve this. Certainly, every level of government could do things to help, you know, get us through until we have the solution. But we need all three levels of government to work together and come together, and they're not doing that. They don't want to work together. They want to blame each other, and until we get past that, I don't think we're gonna see anything.
Craziest thing about the whole week, I think last week, was Ford saying stay out of municipal housing issues.
Yeah.
Like that to me was, showed to me completely how out of touch this man is with what's happening on the ground. Like people, our neighborhoods, our cities, they are screaming for help. And the government, the provincial government, is not giving it to them. Like one of the easiest things that could happen is for these ODSP and OW rates to increase instantly, and that would solve so many problems. I was out walking around the other day in a downtown neighborhood. There are apartments for rent, but they're out of reach for so many people. And the people who need them the most, like the ODSP people and the OW people on social assistance and the lower income people, there's no mechanism for them to enter into the market with either subsidization or increased ODSP rents. I mean, the provincial government, I firmly believe, is waiting on the federal government to come down with their the DERB, the disability enhancement and whatever benefit, in order that they don't have to anymore. So, the poor are just being this ping pong going back and forth between governments, and nobody's taking any responsibility for them.
Well, and Margaret, don't you think if we just had a basic income established across Canada, we would get so much further? I mean, for goodness sakes, we saw here in Hamilton what the impact of that was, and in Peterborough and other cities. And, Kathleen Wynne was in town last week again, speaking about it. She was in front of Senate last week as well, really trying to get this, we saw what CERB did, right? We saw what CERB did.
A universal basic income program would be
Absolutely
amazing, and it would, across the country, it would solve so many problems, and it would help so many more.
Yeah. And you know what? Go ahead, Margaret. Yeah.
Rent controls and vacancy controls. I mean, you cannot have this continuing, because it's going to continue. It's the nature of the beast to continue to try and squeeze as much profit as it can out of the marketplace, right? So unless there's some kind of controls in place around such things that are so vital to our health and well-being, which is housing, we're not really going to solve the problem.
Well, you could challenge Mr. Danko there with his business mind and say, okay, let's get inclusionary zoning in with all your developers, right? Let's set aside 20% of all your builds to be deeply affordable. Then you see your economy grow, Mr. Danko.
And also cities like Toronto and Burnaby, they have rental replacement policies. So like in Toronto, a tenant that has to leave because the building is being torn down and rebuilt or whatever, the landlord has to offer the unit back to the tenant first. The tenant has first right of refusal. That's a municipal level policy. Hamilton could do that, but Hamilton hasn't. ACORN's trying to get them to do it, but they're really dragging their feet. And provincial, there's lots of vacancy control and rent control that the provincial government can do, but even the federal government could mandate rent control in all provinces, just like that, to disincentivize landlords from evicting long-term tenants and to help maintain the units. And yeah, the every build should have a certain amount of affordable units. And also, anytime an affordable unit is taken off the market, it has to be replaced by one somewhere else on the market. Like, we can't just keep losing this affordable stock and not have it replenished in any way.
I love that. I love they're very specific and they're very doable. We've got a federal election heating up, as we know. We've got a provincial government that is under a lot of scrutiny right now. And we've got a local council that didn't get a project done that would have at least helped a few people. They've kicked it down the can down the road, and people are upset about it, right? So all three levels of government have a role to play, from what I'm hearing from all of you. Yes. All three levels need to play it and need the pressure to do that very thing. Margaret, go ahead.
This is what I wanted to say, because we are blaming the government and we're saying the government, but we just went through this process with HATS where there was, honestly, it wasn't perfect, agreed, it wasn't perfect, but there was already an encampment there that was much worse than what that situation could possibly have been with all of its security and controls. And the community said no. The community lost its mind and said no for, whatever reason, for, we weren't asked, and this is, in no way for me to want to make enemies in the North End, but somebody's got to step forward and say, hey, there's now, when I walk through Victoria Park, because that's my park, Used to be lots of encampments in it. There's nobody in it now. I think there's one tent now. You would think then that the solution has been found and that we have no more encampments in our parks and our homeless people are all housed, but they're not. They've just moved someplace else. So all of us are living with this very, very false sense of security, thinking that the problem is dealt with just because they're not in the park, but they're in other park.
53% of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. That's the level of vulnerability that we have. And in Kitchener-Waterloo, there was an article that struck me this week that came out. They have had a 39% increase in the last 3 years in refugees who are seeking housing supports who are homeless. To your point earlier, Renee, we have so many people who need access to deeply affordable housing and transitional housing. And I'm so glad, just to end on this point, Stewart, that you brought it up. You use the word deeply affordable housing stock because I have seen the narrative shift. I'm not an expert in this topic, but I do language. I've seen this, clever little shifting from affordable housing now being kind of subjective. I mean, it's affordable if you have a good job and you want to live there. No, that's not what we're talking about. Let's be clear. We're talking about deeply affordable housing, something that people can actually access. And without a basic income, which of course I support, people aren't even making a living wage to be able to access these apartments and live. So this problem will get bigger. Just because it's a large problem doesn't mean there aren't clear solutions that all of you have articulated today. It's about the political will to actually tackle the problem and get over the stigma about it. And I'll have John Paul back on the program so he can respond to these comments because, I know he's a good sport and he will and he needs to. But let me just each give you one last thought, something you want to leave with our audience, something that, they should understand or do in order to help the people who right now tonight could die on our streets in this province because they're homeless. Let me go to you first, Stewart, and then I'll end on Renee.
So we can go a step further than deeply affordable housing, and that is to remove housing and shelter from the commodities market, remove the ability to gain profit from hoarding shelter. If we eliminate that, the housing market becomes worlds better overnight because no one is absorbing all of this capital from the poor and working classes.
Well, I will say that Mayor Olivia Chow has a very, very ambitious plan for 65,000 affordable units, and there's a lot of critics to it. But she said, well, if I don't set the target, how are we going to come over those obstacles? A lot of it has to do with rent controls, but it's also about a wartime housing effort to get the public sector building housing. Housing Hamilton hasn't been a success, I'll agree. But if we leave it to the for-profit sector, all we've seen are renovictions and affordability. So I take your point, Stewart. Let me go to you, Margaret, and then Renee to close us off.
I'm looking at my list that I wrote, and I think we touched on everything except for one thing. And it was has to do with the mayor's superpowers. And if there was ever a reason for the mayor to be using superpowers, it would be this kind of situation where we're not going to get some kind of consensus in the community about where we need to be putting housing. Nobody wants hats in their backyard, but had them, I don't know whether or not this would have fallen under what those superpowers would have entailed her to do. But had that been a possibility to use, this is what we need. We need leadership, and we have to stop talking among ourselves about what the problem is, the solutions, and somebody to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. I'm the leader. Bah, done.
Yep. Let's be frank, the mayor was bullied by an organized group in the North End. I'm not saying some North End residents didn't have serious concerns about being consulted and they wanted and had a right to more information, but there was some organized effort behind that, and we cannot let that be the standard or we will never help anyone in this town. We need leaders. I love that you call strong mayor powers superpowers, though. I'd like a superhero in this conversation at any point. Renee, you're the superhero.
Yeah, right. So 5 years ago, we closed a food bank at St. Matthew's. So I'll give you a little message of hope before we all go. Okay, this is a good story. And closing a food bank, of course, is not a really great thing to do, but we thought we need to see longer term solutions to poverty, food security. So we switched our whole program approach. But in doing that, we also found out that the building itself wasn't in great shape. So what do? We're a small not-for-profit agency struggling, and Laura knows how we were struggling back then. I got our board to commit to ripping down the building, and now we're building 15 units of deeply affordable housing for Black and Indigenous seniors who are experiencing homelessness. And we're working with the African Canadian Caribbean Association, the Hamilton Regional Indian Center, so that the supports that are provided once folks are housed, they will be there, they'll be culturally appropriate, and they will be real and relevant so that people don't have this issue of leaving or not wanting to be housed or not feeling supported or whatever. So for me, there is hope. And what I like to leave people with, if a little agency like St. Matthew's House can kind of lean in, and we did this all during the pandemic, we raised $8 million to get this building going. And Margaret, you didn't hear me out there yattering a lot with people about this, right? We did it very strategically, and we did it in a very focused way, and here we are. And so you can do it, Margaret. You just need that bold leader who's willing to rip down a building, even though it's controversial.
Yeah, neither is a superhero among us. You know what? And there are many. And we had on a woman who actually housed people in Kitchener-Waterloo and started their HATS program. Her advice on the Oshow when I talked to her a couple months ago was just do it, just lead and do it, and let the city politicians catch up. So thank you all for all that you're doing. Of course, we'll have you back in the future. We ended on a hopeful note, but I am also very grateful that we gave a whole bunch of things that people can actually do. So federally, provincially, locally, stop blaming each other and do some of the things on the list today on the Oshow. Anything is better than nothing. One step at a time. People are freezing to death. This is Canada. We can do better. Thank you all for being on the Oshow, and thank you for watching. Subscribe on YouTube. We'll keep bringing you the great programming. Thanks, everybody. And
Thanks, Laura.
Stay well.
Thank you.
Take care.
When you care about current affairs, it's on the Oshow. And when you want to get clear what's going on here, it's on the Oshow. If you like to stay in the know, tune yourself into the Oshow. It's the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. With a lot of great guests, she puts them to the test on the Oshow. There's no doubt they'll be calling them out on the Oshow. Stand for something or fall for it all. Ontario, hear the call of the Oshow. It's a podcast, the Oshow. Laura Babcock's the Oshow. Stay informed with the Oshow.